What's going on, guys? I am back, and we're going to be talking about the grid wildcard spot going into majors and the reasoning behind, at least for my own opinion. Now, again, why the grid wildcard was the number one, was only number one, and it didn't go down the list. Now, before we start this video, I just want to mention, obviously, I help Psionics with some of these formats, and I give them my opinions, but it's not just me, right? It's not only up to me of what we do. So I just say, hey, here's what I like. And they're like, you know what? That works. Or let's modify it. Let's come up with some compromise or something like that. So to keep that in mind, these opinions are my own. These are not opinions of Psionics. And I just want to talk about why I liked in this first split the grid wildcard only going to number one. Now, again, one thing to note is we are very loosey-goosey on what could happen in future splits. There is avenues to possibly change what we do with the grid or whatever. Now, there's no promises there, but we are open to change. Between myself and Psionics, that's generally what we kind of go through this whole season of playing around with formats, changing things up, see what people like. So keep that in mind going forward. It might change, it might not, but there's a possibility at least is what I want to bring up. Now, let's go over why wildcard number one, in my opinion, was the right move for this first split. The first thing I want to talk about is whenever I try and build formats out, you build them by looking at what could possibly go wrong. The worst case with your format, and is the worst case still viable in this format? And that is a crucial part, I think, for this grid wildcard, where, say, everyone's been, so I shouldn't say everyone, but there's been a lot of comments that have been saying, hey, why didn't the grid wildcard just go down the line? So we take top 15 from RLCS X and then just go down the line until we find a team that's not in RLCS X and they get the last spot. Well, worst case scenario there is, let's just look at right now. Let's look at Europe for this case. Now, this is not really. This is beyond worst case where a team disbands, and obviously worst case would be every single team disbands, and all that. So worst case scenario in a plausible scenario. But say, all 15 teams in the top 15 were from the grid, and I think honestly, that's not that hard for that to actually happen because last season, these were your top 15 teams. So that does make some sense, right? And obviously, you would expect maybe one or two outliers at the very least. And that's basically what we got. But say that did happen. Now, say the last team, say a Dignitas, they just get in because they came in last in the grid. That would be completely unfair. Say Dignitas was last on the grid, or down here 14th is fine. Even if they were 12th, and they went out in the top 32 round every single regional, and they got the spot over a team that did so much better. Finished top 16. That feels rightfully that they earned that spot, right? So instead of taking the next best team in RLCS X, the main competition for this event and obviously to go to the major, you take a team that did terrible in regionals and did terrible in the grid, which really means they shouldn't be here. Now, obviously, that did not happen. What would have happened was actually Oxygen and Triple Trouble would have played a tiebreaker because they finished 15th and 16th. If Oxygen, say, won that, it would have went to Team Liquid. If they would have lost that, it would have went to Oxygen. So also, that kind of stinks too because then Oxygen's well, why should we play a tiebreaker? So at that point, probably Triple Trouble would have just got the spot and not Team Liquid because honestly, there's really no point of playing the tiebreaker at that point because of that. And then Oxygen's playing for Team Liquid's life, which really doesn't make sense. So instead, it would have been probably both those teams, they get in because Oxygen was third in points. But say, again, Oxygen and Team Liquid, if these are the two teams competing, if their regional performance matched their grid performance, well, then they would have been down here, down in this 12 to 13 range. And then you're fighting for spots oh, look, waiting to see who doesn't come in last in this grid to see if they can make it to the major. It's like that really just doesn't feel great. So instead, it's like you have to win the grid in order to get in. Now, the other reason why, and obviously this is very restrictive, only having number one go in. That might change. That might not. But also, the reason being that I liked only number one going in for this first grid was because there was no avenue to get into this grid. Now, obviously, there was one spot in Europe because of a disband, but in normal cases, no one disbands, and there was no avenue to actually get in this season. It was all based on last season's performance. And I felt like with everything being so open and all of that, that it feels a little bit bad that teams didn't even have a chance to get into the grid, and then if they lose out on one of their major spots because of that, when a team does like mediocre in the grid, that would feel pretty bad. And again, that's more based on that. Like I think Oxygen was obviously an outlier of they did really well in the grid and did poorly in regionals. So let's look at the worst case scenario on the other side. So worst case scenario here, obviously, we talked about it earlier. A team like Dignitas or just anyone down in like the 14th, 15th range, and they get in because everyone else in the grid has already made that major, which makes a lot of sense. So worst case on the other side is Oxygen misses out by 10 points to make top 16. Or even they tie, we'll say. Well, actually, I guess worst case would be there would be 10 points down, so there is no tiebreaker game. Because I think a tiebreaker game would prove, if they lost it, that, like, you know, the other team's better. So we'll say 10 points down. And the other team is a non-grid team in the top 16. And Oxygen missed out on making that by 1 point. Say they had 992 here, right below Vitality. Now, again, that feels terrible for Oxygen, right? Missing out by 1 point. But at the end of the day, like, the argument is like, man, Oxygen was so close, they should have been in. And then it's like, you can always argue that with, well, they were in the same three regionals as Team X in the top 16, and they did worse. So it's like, they had their chances. Where the opposite is true, where if you do the very last spot, it's like, well, that team did better than the team in grid, but just because that team was in grid, they get the spot. It feels kind of bad that way. So that's really the push and pull, is when I try and create formats, is about looking at the worst case and then seeing how we can make that better or make the worst case not feel terrible. Now, obviously, again, when you get down to the very worst case, like we just said with the Oxygen, it's still like, oh, that sucks, but there is an argument against it, right? When the opposite is like, should this team be here or not? So that's generally what I do when I try and build out formats. And that's just to give you guys some type of reasoning behind, at least my opinion of it, of why only number one in the grid for split one was the way it was. Now, again, these teams obviously, like in the grid, are playing for $90,000 throughout the time, so they get a little bit of a bonus there, where they get $10,000 weeklies. So that's always good for them, so they can just get more prize money. And I could see some of these players obviously getting a little bit burnt out from that or whatever. But at the end of the day, Rocket League's your job, right? And, you know, I guess they don't have to show. I honestly don't know. I don't know how all that works. But that is my reason. Again, we're getting sidetracked here of why grid number one was the only way to get in, and not the alternative of let's just go down the entire line and find a team not in the regional and just give them the spot. That's pretty much the reason, is mostly just because then you're competing a very real possibility, and obviously this didn't happen this time, but I think a pretty good probability you're competing near the bottom of like 12th through 14th. If we look back onto the NA side real quick, we'll show what would have happened there. For top 15, getting in, and then the very last spot going to a team. That would have, I would assume, would have been version 1. I'm trying to look down this list to make sure. Yeah, so it would have been version 1, a team that came in 10th. And it's like, why should we give a team that came in 10th out of all this a spot compared to, you know, a team that earned it through the top 16, where this team made 2 brackets, 1 top 4, which is good at the very end. But if I do some quick math here, They made a bracket. Like, I guess it's hard to tell if they're 2-0 or 2-1. I'm going to assume that these are 2-1s just for the hell of it. So we'll say 2-2 round there. And I think one of them wasn't, so we'll give them that. So 2-1, 1-2. So what are we at? Well, let's just count their wins. How about that? 2 wins, 1. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 wins there. And then they got 3 wins here. So 10 wins total and 18 losses, maybe 17 losses. I think it would have been 17 losses. So 10-17, like a team that goes 10-17 in the grid. And they deserve the spot over a team that finished like in the actual rankings. Like, I don't know about that, like Ghost Gaming. And that's also like another caveat of like where I guess you could argue in the worst case scenario, it's like one team in regionals finishes 10 points above. So say like Ghost Gaming here. And say version 1 was only 10 points down, 150. But then version 1 came number 2 in grid while Ghost Gaming came in dead last in grid. And that would probably be even a worst case scenario for this way of doing it. But at the end of the day, again, still, it's like, well, they played in the same 3 regionals. You can always have that argument. Maybe version 1 is the better team, but, you know, it's RLCS X points, not grid points, yada, yada. That one, I think, is a little bit of a better argument for the opposite, or maybe not the opposite, but at least that worst-case scenario being pretty bad. Because as we can see here, Ghost Gaming, where did Ghost finish? Oh, yeah, the Omelet. So they finished below version 1 here, but they get the last spot while version 1 did not. So, like, again, there I think you could have a small argument, but I think it's still better than the worst-case scenario on the opposite side of just bringing teams down from the 14th, 15th area. So there you go. And one thing here, obviously, it's like only a 40-point difference anyway. And once again, they played in all 3 of the same regionals. One team did better. One team did not. We'll see what we do. Split 2. We'll see what happens. Grid will be back. We will also have a 24-team format. So definitely come look for that for RLCS X. I'm not sure when we're announcing all of that, all those plans, but we'll let you know when they want us to let you know. But that's it for me. I just kind of wanted to talk through of the idea of format building and the idea behind just number 1 in grid for this time around. So just having a little discussion. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.